approach the book of Esther, we come to what I think is probably one of my favorite books in the Bible, although for many it was questioned whether or not it should be in the Bible, and we'll talk about that as we go. Esther is the last of the historical books. The story of Esther tells the story of sometime in the Persian captivity, after Babylon has already been overthrown, and we're into the Persian captivity with the King Ahasuerus. It really talks about the preservation of the Jews, and more importantly, the preservation of the Messianic line, so that Jesus could be born. And it's really interesting to watch and to see how that then applies for us. How important the book of Esther is for us as believers today, because had it not been for God's working in and through Esther, it would have been difficult. Now we do know that God would have delivered somehow, because even as Mordecai tells Esther later in the book, whether it's you or not, God will deliver his people. But Esther was in a very specific place where she could do that. So the book of Esther is a great little book. Esther has been questioned all along. In fact, a lot of people that we hold dear didn't like the book. Martin Luther did not like the book of Esther, thought it was too much of a little Jewish book. Calvin questioned the book of Esther. So there's a lot of question of where the book of Esther, and the questions arose because as you read the book of Esther, you find no reference to the law, no reference to prayer, no reference to Jerusalem, no reference to the temple, and no reference to God at all. So it's interesting that none of that is there, and yet as you read the book, you will see all of that. You'll see God's hand. When I preached through the book of Esther years ago, my title for the book of Esther was "Behold the Mighty Hand of the Invisible God," because that's what you see. You see the history taking place. As you see the history taking place, it's important to remember that in the glove of history is God's hand moving the fingers. So it's an important little book because of historically where it falls, but it's also an important little book in regards to the Messianic line, because it preserves the Messianic line through Mordecai and through Esther. Esther would make a really good made-for-TV movie. In fact, it has been made for TV and made for the big screen. Unfortunately, I think a lot of those tellings of the tale make it a love story between Ahasuerus and Esther, and it is no such thing. It is no such thing. It is a love story, but it's a love story between God and his nation Israel. That's who the love story is between. Because as you look at the character of those in the book, you cannot find a human person whose character is flawless. Everyone is flawless. A lot of folks try to add flawlessness to Mordecai and add flawlessness to Esther. We don't need to do that. We don't need to do that to make the story a great story. We don't need to do that to help us understand. In fact, when we don't do that, I think it makes it even more of a miracle that God does what he does, because he uses imperfect people to accomplish his perfect purpose. And so read it that way. Don't read it as I would encourage you, as you read the book of Esther, to forget what you've heard in the past, to stop thinking about the movies you've seen, to stop thinking about Esther as a victim and Mordecai as a victim, but rather see them as important people in the hands of God. I read one commentary that said the book of Esther is like a chess game between God and Satan, and but he uses real kings and real bishops and real knights to accomplish his purpose, and that's kind of true. And when Satan has Haman issue the decree to destroy the Jews, Satan hollers check, and then God does what he's going to do with Esther and Ahasuerus, and then God hollers checkmate. So it can't be undone. So that's just a little bit of background as you approach the book of Esther. I think Esther is a great, like I said, a great play, a great a dramatic series. And so I think you could actually divide it easily into a series of a series of acts in a play. Like the first act, that's how I divide it. The first act is found in Esther chapter 1 with the days of the casting off of Queen Vashti. As we enter the scene, Persia is now in charge, and the king of Persia is a guy named Ahasuerus. that is actually his title. Ahasuerus is his title, like Pharaoh is the title of the Egyptian king. Ahasuerus is the title of the Persian king. So read that as his name, his title and his name. But he is leading Persia at that point. And as he's leading Persia, Persia is getting ready to go to battle. This is all Act 1. Persia is getting ready to go to battle. And what the Persian kings did when they got ready to go to battle, they would have a big party and get as drunk as they could, because they felt like as when they were drunk that the spirits of the gods would move through them and help them make accurate plans. And I believe that's why the Persians lost as much as they did, because they were always drunk when they were making their plans. But Ahasuerus has a big party. At the end of the big party, he calls Vashti to come in and dance. She refuses. She refuses to do so. In fact, if you want to find somebody that does something good and something right in the book of Esther, Vashti is the one who does this in refusing to go dance before Ahasuerus and the rest of the Persian leaders. She refuses. Ahasuerus gets mad. Not only does Ahasuerus get mad, but the people, the rest of the 7 leaders of Persia also get angry and are afraid that if Vashti can talk to Ahasuerus that way, then all the wives can talk to their husbands that way, and they won't be in charge of their homes anymore. Their wives will be. So Ahasuerus follows their advice and has Vashti deposed as queen. It's likely he had her executed as queen. And then he goes off to war. Goes off to war, and the war goes terribly. This is Act 2. Goes off to war, the war goes terribly. He comes back, and instead of having consolation from his queen, he has no queen to come back to. And so in order to save their necks, the 7 leaders of Persia get together and suggest to him a contest. Some folks have called it a beauty contest. It really is not a beauty contest. It's more of another kind of contest where they are the girls were brought before him, given a night with the king, and he would then choose who he wanted to be the queen, the sitting queen. Well, the story goes that Mordecai was living, and this is according to Josephus, Mordecai is living up in Babylon, and when this decree is issued that these virgin girls should come to Susa, to the capital city, and to enroll in this kind of a party or contest. That's what I'm looking for. They should come, and they should he came from Babylon down to Susa, and then encouraged Esther, his kind of adopted daughter, more of his cousin, to enter and to go into this contest. And so she does that. As she does that, we find that Mordecai is actually serving in the king's service. He's sitting at the king's gate, and he, being a Jew, would not bow down to Haman, who is an Agagite. Agag, you might remember, is an Amalekite who is an Edomite, and so you have a Jew refusing to bow to an Edomite. Go back to Jacob and Esau, where the younger would rule the older. And so I believe that Haman understood that. Mordecai understood that. And so because Mordecai understood that, he refused to bow to Haman. It's not that what you read, that Mordecai was so holy that he wouldn't bow to anybody except God. That's not what's going on at all. If Mordecai is serving in the king's palace, in the king's place, he's bowed to Ahasuerus numerous times, or he would have been dead already. But he refused to bow to Haman because he recognized that Haman was a descendant of Esau. He, being a descendant of Jacob, would not then bow to an Edomite. So you have all those years of issues now boiling back up. Why did Haman hate the Jews? Well, because of the way that Mordecai treated him, but more because it was the Jews through Saul that nearly eliminated the Amalekites and the Agagites. But Saul left some alive, and here it is again, knowing that sin is going to affect future generations. Now Saul's sin is actually bringing to a close close the nation of Israel, because he refused to do what God called him to do. And so you have this contest starting. You have this issue, but in this we also see where Mordecai saved the king's life. It's kind of a little vignette, a kind of little aside. You see Mordecai saving the king's life, and that's going to become huge as we proceed through the rest of the book. And then as we approach the next section, the next act, we have Haman now, because of his hatred for the Jews and because of his hatred really for Mordecai, Haman now hatches a plot in which he will exterminate the Jews. And in doing so, he rolls dice. They're called Purim in the book. And it was like casting lots, rolling dice, whatever it was. It was something that they would use to determine dates and times and who would win and who would lose, those kinds of things. So Haman rolls the dice, casts the Purim, and he lands on a day that he would go before the king Ahasuerus and ask for permission to annihilate the Jews. And he does this in a very special way. He does it by promising a lot of silver and a lot of benefit to King Ahasuerus. And so Ahasuerus, because he does like money, because he needs to fund his army, because he's just come through a major defeat of the Persians by the Greeks, he needs that influx of cash. And so he tells Haman, write what you want to. Go write it, and here's my ring, seal it, and it's going to be a law. It's a law of the Medes and Persians, which can't be changed. So once a decree was issued by a king of the Medes and Persians, it was impossible to change that decree. You couldn't nullify the decree because the Persian kings were considered to be God. And in nullifying a decree, you were saying that God somehow made a mistake, and they wouldn't do that. Ahasuerus was so crazy and so full of himself that at one point in the previous war, the Persians were building a bridge to cross a river, and it was a failed attempt, and a storm came up at night and blew the bridge away. So what Ahasuerus did was he had the river lashed 300 times. They would go hit the engineers. He had them killed. So that's how kind of crazy Ahasuerus was. But he agrees to Haman's plan, not knowing that Mordecai and Esther are Jews because they've hidden their heritage at this point. Well, then Mordecai goes into this period of mourning, and he's mourning at the king's gate. Not something you want to do in Persia. You don't want to make the Persian kings mad. Just like Nehemiah, when he goes in to see the king, had a sad face, and it was scary for him to do that. Same way with the Ahasuerus. You don't want to go see him being sad. Now Mordecai is actually throwing dust on his head, wearing sackcloth, and is wailing, mourning in front of the king's place, and he's really risking his life in saddening the king. But he's doing it so that he can draw attention, I believe, to the plight of the Jews. He encourages Esther to go in and talk to the king and see what he will do about it. Esther has reservations, of course, because she hasn't been called into the king for 30 days. And if you don't get called to the king, you can't just go before him, because the king sat on his throne, and there were guys with large axes that would cut your head off if the king didn't extend his scepter to you. After a series of debates, Esther asks Mordecai and all the people to fast. It's interesting. She doesn't say fast and pray. She says fast. I believe that's for a purpose, because of the way that the book was preserved. If it had reference to a god other than the Persian god, it would have probably been thrown away. But it was preserved for us to have. So Esther agrees to go before the king and to ask him. On the night before the banquet that she has is going to take place, Ahasuerus has a dream. Actually, he can't sleep. So he calls for the history books to be read to him so that he can be able to sleep. Everybody goes to sleep reading history, so Ahasuerus thought he could do the same thing. But he happened to read. It just so happened that the chronicles were open to the part where Mordecai revealed the plot to kill Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus asked, has anybody been blessed for that or rewarded for that? And the answer is no. And so he determines to reward Mordecai. And as Haman is coming in thinking things are going well for him, Haman comes in, and Ahasuerus says, what shall be done to the guy who the king wants to honor? And he has this great plan. This is one of the most funny things in the whole book, and one you're going to laugh at as you read, because he has these great plans, and he has this idea of what he'll do, walk around with the guy on a white horse with the king's robe on, and give him, and to say, this is what's done for a man who honors the king. And as he's thinking it's going to be him, it ends up being Mordecai. So he has to walk through the city with his arch enemy really proclaiming before, this is how it's done to the man the king wants to honor. So the biggest turn of events yet. Esther will reveal the plot. The Jews will be saved. They will have their own opportunity to respond. And at the end of the book, the Feast of Purim is inaugurated. It begins here. It's one of the two feasts of the Jews that aren't found in the law. They're out of the law feasts. The Feast of Hanukkah and the Feast of Purim are outside. And so Esther institutes the Feast of Purim. Again, as you read the book, don't look for the human heroes. Look for God, who's the hero to deliver the Jews and deliver them well. And to basically, the key is that the Jews, the line of the Jews is now down to one guy named Zerubbabel, who is alive in Jerusalem. And if Zerubbabel is gone, then the line of Messiah stops, because he's in both Mary and Joseph's line. So if he's there, then the line stops. But God does a wonderful thing in providing for us salvation because of his work through Mordecai, through Esther, and through those series of events. So I hope you enjoy reading the book. It's a fun read. It's funny at times. It's tragic at times, but just enjoy reading through the book.